July 14, 1916. Somme Valley, northern France. 2:47 a.m. The world is ending in mud. Private William Layton crouches in a shell crater, rain hammering his steel helmet like nails on a coffin lid. Around him, the landscape has ceased to be earth. It is a churning sea of clay and corpses, barbed wire and splintered wood. The artillery has been silent for 23 minutes, the longest pause in 6 days. In that terrible quiet, men pray, write letters they'll never send, or simply stare into darkness. Layton moves through the trench, boots sucking at the waterlogged ground. His battalion has taken what used to be a German position. Now it's just another wound in the earth. And that's when he sees it. Half buried beneath collapsed timber and broken stone, black lacquer gleaming wetly in the moonlight. A piano. An upright, impossibly intact. The keys visible through the rubble like teeth in a shattered jaw. He doesn't know it yet, but this moment will ripple across both armies. It will create a legend whispered in trenches from Ypres to Verdun. It will stop a war just for minutes. And when archaeologists dig through this sector a century later, they will find something in the earth that shouldn't exist. A mystery that begins with music and ends with silence. The instrument that shouldn't exist. To understand what happened at the Somme that summer requires understanding what that piano represented, not just as an object, but as an impossibility. By July 1916, the Battle of the Somme had already become synonymous with industrial-scale death. On the first day alone, July 1st, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, nearly 20,000 dead before noon. The offensive was designed to break the German lines through overwhelming force. Instead, it became a meat grinder that would consume over 1 million casualties across 5 months. There was no room for civilization here, no place for art or beauty or anything soft. The Western Front had its own ecosystem, one that swallowed everything human. Villages vanished, forests became forests of stumps, churches collapsed into their own crypts. Every structure that once held human life was systematically destroyed, then destroyed again, then pulverized into the mud until the land itself became unrecognizable. For a piano to survive here was absurd. These instruments weigh between 300 and 500 pounds. They're fragile, temperamental, constructed of wood that warps with moisture and strings that snap under tension. The Western Front had artillery shells capable of creating craters 30 feet deep, shrapnel that could shred a horse, gas that could melt lungs. Yet, here it was. Records suggest the piano came from the village of Auvillers-la-Bocelle, a settlement of 250 souls that was completely erased during the first days of the offensive. The Germans had occupied it since 1914, fortifying the village into a fortress of concrete bunkers and deep dugouts. When the British finally took it, or what remained of it, on July 16th, they found only rubble. But before the final bombardment, during the 2 years of German occupation, there had been attempts at normalcy. Letters home from German soldiers stationed at Auvillers mention a music room established in the basement of what had been the mayor's house. Officers brought instruments, a violin, a gramophone, and yes, a piano, salvaged from a nearby chateau and hauled through the mud by men who wanted desperately to remember they were human. When the British bombardment began on June 24th, 7 days of continuous shelling preceded the infantry assault. 1 million shells. The earth itself seemed to liquefy. Everything German was buried, blown apart, or burned. Everything except the piano. The soldier who played. William Layton was 22 years old, a clerk from Manchester. Before the war, he'd worked in a textile office, recording shipments in neat columns, living with his mother and sister in a narrow house that smelled of coal smoke and boiled vegetables. His one indulgence, piano lessons. Every Thursday evening, he walked 40 minutes to Mrs. Caldwell's house, where she taught him Chopin nocturnes and Bach preludes with a stern attention to finger placement. He wasn't gifted, but he was persistent. The piano offered him what his life otherwise lacked: a sense that beauty could be created through discipline, that order could emerge from chaos if you just knew which keys to press. The war found him in February 1915. He enlisted not from patriotism, but from social pressure. The white feathers, the posters, the women who stopped talking to young men in civilian clothes. By June, he was in France. By July 1916, he was at the Somme. His diary, held now in the Imperial War Museum, catalogued but rarely displayed, records the discovery. July 14th. Found a piano in the German dugout. Covered in muck, but the keys move. Played a bit of Chopin. Felt like a ghost touching it. Like reaching back to a world that doesn't exist anymore. Miller thought I was mad. Maybe I am. The battalion was due to rotate back to reserve positions in 3 days. Until then, they held this section of captured trench, waiting for orders, enduring sporadic shelling. The days were spent in survival mode, repairing sandbags, clearing bodies, and trying to sleep in mud that never dried. But the nights. Leighton played. The music in the dark. Understand the soundscape of the Western Front. 24 hours a day, noise. Artillery fire rolling like thunder that never stops. Machine gun fire, that distinctive rapid chatter. Rifle shots. Screams. The wet crunch of earth being thrown skyward. Shells whistling overhead with a sound that drilled into the spine. The crump of detonation. The hiss of gas canisters. The cries of wounded men in no man's land begging for water, for morphine, for death. Silence was terrifying. Silence meant something was about to happen. But music? Music was impossible. Leighton dragged the piano up from the collapsed dugout with the help of 3 others. It took 4 hours. They used planks as levers, rope salvaged from German equipment, and the desperate strength of men who needed something, anything that wasn't mud and death. They positioned it in a relatively protected corner of the trench, covered by a corrugated iron sheet that served as a crude roof. The keys were caked with dirt. Several strings were broken. The wood was split in places. But when Leighton sat on an overturned ammunition crate and pressed the middle C, the note rang out clear and true. The men stopped. For 5 seconds, the entire trench went still. Then someone laughed, a real laugh, not the bitter bark they'd all learned, and someone else said, "Play us a tune, Professor." That first night, July 14th, Leighton played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. He played it badly, fingers stiff from cold and disuse, missing notes, rushing passages. But every man within earshot stood frozen, listening. Some wept. Others stared into the darkness, transported. When he finished, no one applauded. They simply returned to their posts, to their small fires, to their letters home. But something had shifted. The next night, he played again. The German listener. No man's land at the Somme averaged 250 yards across, the distance of 2.5 football fields. Close enough to hear voices, close enough to throw grenades, close enough to smell the cooking fires from enemy trenches, and close enough to hear piano music. On the German side, Lieutenant Friedrich Weber kept a pocket journal throughout the war. It survived because he mailed it home in installments to his wife in Munich. These pages, archived in the Bavarian State Library, contain this entry dated July 16, 1916. Last night, music. English music, I think. Piano. At first, we thought it was our imagination. We've been under bombardment for so long that silence itself produces ghosts in the mind. But no, someone is playing Chopin in the English trench. Chopin, the same piece my sister plays at Christmas. We listened for 20 minutes. No one fired. It seemed obscene to interrupt it. When it stopped, Sergeant Dietrich said, "That Englander has gentle hands." We all agreed. For 3 nights, the pattern continued. After dark, when artillery quieted and the horror became merely unbearable rather than apocalyptic, Leighton would play, and men on both sides would stop killing each other long enough to listen. This wasn't the Christmas truce of 1914, that spontaneous ceasefire that saw enemies playing football and exchanging gifts. By 1916, such fraternization was strictly forbidden, punishable by court-martial. The war had hardened. The innocence of that first Christmas was gone, buried under 2 years of industrial slaughter. But music travels differently than words. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't require translation. It simply exists, and those who hear it can choose whether to fire into it or honor it. They honored it. July 18, 1916, 9:43 p.m. Rain. Not the ordinary rain of England or Germany, but Somme rain. Rain mixed with clay and chemicals. Rain that turned the battlefield into a nightmare of drowning mud. Rain that filled the trenches ankle-deep, then knee-deep. Rain that made rifles malfunction and turned sleep impossible. Leighton almost didn't play that night. The piano was soaked, covered with a tarpaulin that had blown away in the wind. Water pooled on the keys. Several more strings had snapped from the moisture. The instrument was dying by inches, just like everything else in this place. But Private Miller, a Scotsman who'd barely spoken since watching his brother die on July 1st, said quietly, "Play anyway, William, please." So he played. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, first movement, the melodic one that sounds like rain itself given form. His fingers slipped on the wet keys. The notes came out waterlogged, muffled, half the piano now silent where strings had failed. But he played. And then, across no man's land, a voice, German, male, clear despite the rain. "Bravo!" Then again, "Bravo! Noch einmal!" Once more. Leighton's fingers froze above the keys. Every British soldier in earshot reached for their rifles. This was a violation of every instinct that had kept them alive. The enemy doesn't shout appreciation. The enemy shoots. The enemy throws grenades. The enemy kills. But the voice came again, louder. "Bitte, please, play again." And then, impossibly, the sound of applause, clapping, from the German trench, multiple hands. Lieutenant Davidson, the officer in charge of this section, stood with his pistol drawn, staring into the rainy darkness. Later, he would report this moment to his superiors and be told he'd suffered shell shock. But in that moment, he made a decision that defined him. He lowered his pistol. "Play something else, Leighton," he said quietly. "Give them an encore." So Leighton did. He played Danny Boy, an Irish melody that every British soldier knew, but which spoke to something deeper than nationalism. It spoke of loss, of homes left behind, of young men who wouldn't return. As he played, men emerged slightly from their trenches on both sides. Not into no man's land, that would be suicide, but upward, enough to hear better. British and German soldiers stood in the rain, separated by wire and craters and orders to kill each other, listening to the same melody drift through the fog. For 7 minutes and 32 seconds, the war paused. When the final note faded, silence. No applause this time, just the rain and the soft sound of men weeping in the darkness. Then a German voice, younger, called out in broken English, "Thank you, Tommy. Thank you for beautiful." And the war resumed. The destruction, July 19th, 4:32 a.m. German artillery, responding to a British raid 3 miles north, began a retaliatory bombardment. The shells came in waves, walking up and down the line, searching for ammunition dumps and strong points. One shell, a 150mm high explosive round, landed directly in Leighton's section of trench. The blast killed 2 men instantly, destroyed 30 yards of fortification, and obliterated the piano. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but splinters, wood fragments embedded in sandbags, wire strings tangled in the barbed wire overhead. The piano's frame, the iron harp that held the strings, was bent and blackened, twisted by the heat of the explosion. Leighton survived. He'd been at the latrines, 50 yards away, when the shell hit. He ran back to find Miller and Davies lying dead, and the piano reduced to debris. His diary entry from that morning: "It's gone. Of course it's gone. Everything beautiful here dies. I don't know why I thought a piano would be different. I don't know why I thought music mattered. Miller is dead. Davies is dead. The piano is matchsticks. Tomorrow we attack again. I don't think I'll survive. I don't think I want to." But he was wrong about one thing. The music hadn't died. The Phantom Piano. The official records of both the British and German armies contain something unusual. Multiple reports, filed by different units in the same sector, describing auditory phenomena that shouldn't exist. August 3rd, British patrol reports hearing piano music from no man's land. Investigation finds nothing. August 17th, German listening post reports enemy music during night watch, described as Chopin or similar classical composition. September 2nd, British stretcher bearers retrieving wounded after a failed assault report hearing piano music near the crater where Leighton's trench had been. The location is confirmed to be empty, just mud and shell holes. The reports continue throughout autumn 1916. Different men, different dates, all describing the same thing: piano music, clear and melodic, drifting through the fog at night. Some explanations were offered: shell shock, mass hallucination, the stress of prolonged combat creating auditory phantoms. But the reports came from men who'd never heard the original piano, who didn't know its story. Fresh reinforcements, men transferred from other sectors. Yet they heard it. Leighton survived the Somme. Wounded in September, evacuated to England, he spent 6 months recovering before returning to France. He survived the war, demobilized in February 1919, returned to Manchester and his mother's house. He never played piano again. In his letters to his sister, preserved by the family and donated to the Imperial War Museum in 1973, he wrote, "You ask if I'll return to Mrs. Caldwell for lessons. I can't, Emily. Every time I think of touching a piano, I'm back there. I hear Miller breathing his last. I hear that shell coming. I hear that German voice calling out 'Bravo!' like we were at a concert hall instead of hell. Music was supposed to be beautiful. I made it into something that got men killed. Or worse, that made them remember they were human, just long enough to suffer more when the killing resumed." He worked as a clerk until his death in 1954. His daughter reported that their house never had a piano. When music played on the radio, he would quietly leave the room. The archaeological evidence. In 2004, a team from the University of Birmingham conducted archaeological surveys of the Somme battlefield, mapping the network of trenches that have gradually been reclaimed by farmland and forest. Using ground-penetrating radar and historical maps, they identified what had been the British lines near Auvilliers-la Boisselle. In a sector matching the coordinates of Leighton's battalion position, they excavated. They found the usual artifacts: shell casings, broken rifles, buttons, boot nails, fragments of gas masks. But they also found something unusual: a large concentration of piano wire. Not just one or two strings, but hundreds of fragments, all clustered in a specific location. And beneath it, partially preserved in the clay, the cast iron frame of a piano, the harp, bent and rusted, but unmistakable. Dr. Richard Hughes, who led the excavation, later wrote, "What struck us wasn't just that we'd found the physical evidence of this piano, which in itself was remarkable, but how it had been treated after destruction. The wire fragments had been carefully gathered, not discarded, but collected and laid in a pattern almost ritualistic. These soldiers took the time, during one of the bloodiest offensives in human history, to create something like a grave for a musical instrument." The frame is now in storage at the Imperial War Museum. It's never been displayed publicly. Too fragile, they say, too damaged. But every historian who's seen it remarks on the same thing. The pattern of shrapnel damage suggests the piano was destroyed by a direct hit. Mathematically, given the size of the target and the randomness of artillery fire, the odds of a single shell striking something as small as a piano in a trench system spanning hundreds of miles approaches astronomical improbability. Almost like it was targeted. Almost like someone, on one side or the other, decided that what the piano represented, that moment of shared humanity, was too dangerous to allow.
What the music meant. The Battle of the Somme ended on November 18, 1916. After 141 days, the British and French armies had advanced approximately 6 miles. The cost? Over 1 million casualties. The strategic objective, breaking the German lines, was not achieved. In that context, a piano seems meaningless, a footnote, a curiosity. But soldiers' letters, diaries, and memoirs from both sides tell a different story. Friedrich Weber, the German lieutenant who recorded hearing the music, survived the war and became a schoolteacher in Munich. In a letter to a British veteran in 1932, part of a reconciliation effort between former enemies, he wrote, "I have spent 16 years trying to make sense of what we did to each other. I teach children about history, about nationalism, about the causes of the war, but I find myself returning always to that night in the rain when one of your men played piano and we stopped being enemies long enough to remember we were brothers. If I have any faith left, it is this, that music can do what diplomacy, reason, and even morality cannot, remind us that we share the same fundamental nature. We all respond to beauty. We all need beauty, even in hell." Private Miller, who died when the piano was destroyed, had written to his mother 3 days earlier. "There's a man here who plays piano. I know that sounds mad, but it's true. When he plays, I close my eyes and I'm back in our parlor, and Jenny is singing, and you're making tea, and Dad is reading his paper. The music makes the war feel temporary. Like this is the interruption, not home. Like someday this will end and we'll go back to being people again, instead of things that kill." The music didn't stop the war. It didn't change the outcome. The slaughter continued for 2 more years, consuming millions more lives. But for those men, in those moments, it did something impossibly precious. It returned them to themselves. The legend grows. By 1917, the story of the Phantom Piano had spread throughout the British Expeditionary Force. New battalions arriving at the Somme sector would be told by veterans, "Listen at night. Sometimes you can still hear it." And they did hear it, or believed they did, or needed to believe they did. The human mind is remarkable in its ability to create meaning from chaos, to find patterns in randomness, to hear music in silence when music is what's needed to survive. Whether the sounds were real, echoes somehow trapped in the landscape, auditory hallucinations shared across thousands of men, or simply the desperate manifestation of hope, the effect was identical. Men wrote home about it, mentioned it in diaries, spoke of it in oral histories recorded decades later. A chaplain named Reverend Edmund Hodgin, attached to the British 34th Division, wrote in his memoir published in 1921, "I was skeptical of the piano stories until October 1916, when I myself heard music during an evening service I conducted in a support trench. Clear as day, Chopin, I believe, though I am no expert. Several men heard it simultaneously. We stopped our prayers to listen. When it ended, Private Watkins said, 'That's our ghost, Reverend. He plays for the lads who didn't make it.' I didn't have the heart to tell him ghosts don't exist. Perhaps in that place, they did." The story crossed trenches. German accounts from 1917 mention Das Geisterpiano, the ghost piano, as a known phenomenon. Some German soldiers considered it good luck to hear it before an attack. Others believed it was a warning of death. The French, taking over British sectors in 1917, heard the stories and added their own, that the piano was played by the ghost of a French civilian killed in the German occupation, that it only appeared before major offensives, that hearing it meant you would survive the war. Myths multiply in darkness. Truth becomes legend, becomes myth, becomes something new, a collective story that serves a deeper need than facts ever could. The Last Hearing. The final documented account comes from November 1918, 11 days before the armistice. Captain James Alderton, medical officer with the British 18th Division, was treating wounded near Auvillers-la-Boisselle, now recaptured from the Germans after changing hands multiple times. In his personal journal, he wrote, "November 1st. The guns have mostly stopped. Everyone knows the end is coming. Tonight, while moving wounded to the dressing station, I heard piano music. Not imagined. I'm certain of it. Chopin's Nocturne, in E-flat. I studied piano as a boy. I know the piece. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My orderly, a skeptical Welshman who believes in nothing but what he can see, stopped and crossed himself. 'The ghost piano,' he whispered. 'The war is nearly done, sir. He's playing us out.' We stood in the ruins and listened until it faded. I found myself weeping, not from sadness, but from the recognition that something beautiful had persisted here, through all of this, that beauty had refused to die. 11 days later, the war ended. The piano was never heard again." July 14th, 2016. Auvillers-la-Boisselle, France. 100 years after William Layton first uncovered the piano, a ceremony was held. Veterans' descendants, historians, musicians, they gathered in the rebuilt village square where a small memorial stone was unveiled. It reads simply, "In memory of the unknown piano, July 1916. In the worst of times, beauty persisted." A pianist, a young woman from the Royal College of Music, played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major on a portable keyboard. The crowd of over 200 stood silent as the same notes that once drifted across no man's land now floated across peaceful farmland where wheat grows over the bones of 1,000,000 dead. When she finished, no one applauded. Just like that night in 1916, the audience simply stood in silence, transported. An elderly man stepped forward, William Layton's grandson. He scattered sheet music over the memorial, photocopies of his grandfather's compositions, written after the war but never performed, never played. Music born from trauma, created in silence, dying in silence. The pages caught the wind, scattered across the field, disappeared into the wheat. Why it matters. The story of the piano at the Somme is not about music, not really. It's about the human capacity to create meaning in meaninglessness, to insist on beauty in the face of mechanized death, to recognize shared humanity with enemies across barbed wire and mud. The First World War marked a transformation in human consciousness. It revealed that industrial civilization could turn its creative genius toward destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. It showed that humans could be reduced to numbers, to casualties, to map coordinates. But the piano showed something else, that even in the most thoroughly mechanized, dehumanized landscape ever created, humans would fight to preserve what makes them human. They would risk their lives to drag a piano through mud,
They would stop killing to listen to beauty. They would hear music in silence because they needed it to survive. William Layton never played piano again, but he wrote in his final diary entry, recorded in a nursing home 3 days before his death in 1954. People ask if I regret playing at the Somme, if I regret what happened to Miller and Davies and the others. I do. I carry those deaths with me every day. But I cannot regret the music itself. For a few nights, we were something more than soldiers. We were humans who recognized beauty when it appeared, even in hell. Maybe especially in hell. If that German man across no man's land took away anything from hearing that music, if it gave him one moment of peace before he died, or if he survived and carried it home to Munich or Berlin or wherever, then something good came from that place. Something survived. Not the piano, not the men, but the idea that we tried, that we insisted, that we played anyway. The page's frame sits in storage. The battlefield is farmland. The men are bones and memories and fading photographs. But on quiet nights in Ovillers-la-Bosselle, local farmers sometimes report hearing music. Probably wind through the crops. Probably imagination. Probably nothing. But they hear it, and they stop their tractors, and they listen. Because beauty demands witnesses. Even phantom beauty, even ghost beauty, especially beauty born from darkness and death, and the insistence that humans are more than the worst things they do to each other. The war took everything, every certainty, every innocence, every young man who believed in heroism and glory. But for 7 minutes and 32 seconds, on a rainy night in July 1916, the war paused. And two enemies stood under the same melody. And the music played on, long after the instrument shattered. It plays still, if you listen.